Hello, my wonderful third graders. We are coming to the towards the end of our colonial America study, but that is not the end of happenings in North America. In fact, one of the biggest things in our history is about to begin, and we're going to start discussing it. And you will probably get to learn more about it next year in fourth grade. We're going to talk about the road to revolution. This is part one. Some vocabulary words you will hear throughout the read aloud. Distressed means upset, concerned, or worried. Influx is an arrival, invasion, flood, or entry. Outspoken refers to someone that speaks in an honest or open way, blunt, direct. Representation is the act of having someone to do something for or on behalf of someone else or a group of people. Steeled means prepared for something difficult, made strong or brave, braced. Taxing means demanding a payment be made to the government, usually to support services provided by the government. Uninhabited means not having anyone living in a place, abandoned, deserted. You've learned about how the English colonies were established and how the colonists lived their lives. Throughout this time, the English, Spanish, and French fought each other over land in North America. They were land hungry and clashed over the areas in North America they wanted for themselves. The Spanish had forced the French out of what is present day Florida and gained control of it. The Spanish also moved into the areas of North America now known as New Mexico, Arizona, California, and Texas. The French were colonizing parts of present-day Canada and had also claimed the Mississippi River Valley for France. Whereas some of these land claims resulted in wars on European soil, other clashes were beginning to take place in North America. At the same time, more and more Europeans were coming to the English colonies and searching for new land to settle. They began to move further west, always from the coastal area. Away from the coastal areas where people had first settled. Over time, the Native Americans began to realize that there would be no end to the influx of people. Influx means more and more people are coming in. In 1675, war broke out in New England. It was time for the Wampanoag to take a stand. Chief Metacom, the son of Chief Massasoit, Massasoit led a war party against some English settlers. This attack turned into an all-out conflict. Eventually, the English settlers won, essentially destroying the Wampanoag tribe and taking even more of their land. As the colonies grew, English explorers continued west across the Appalachian Mountains to what is now the Ohio River Valley. However, this land was not uninhabited either. So if it's inhabited, that means somebody lives there. Uninhabited means nobody lives there. So if it's not uninhabited, that means that people live there. Remember we learned about the Wampanoag in the first Thanksgiving. Who was Massasoit? He was the Wampanoag chief who helped the Pilgrims at Plymouth. The British called Chief Metacom or Metacomet King Philip. This war is sometimes called King Philip's War. Native Americans had been living in this region for a long time, some of them having been forced to move west away from the eastern regions to escape the influx of settlers. The French had also claimed a few areas within the Ohio Valley. The French had established a good trading partnership with various native tribes in the area. They didn't want the English settlers to interfere with this business relationship. Neither the Native Americans nor the French wanted English settlers to build homes upon the land. However, members of the British Parliament wrote to the French and told them that it was a well-known fact that the land belonged to Great Britain and they should go away. The French considered this request and then replied, "Non." This was a bad sign. Conflict was brewing. The Native Americans, distressed by how much land they had already lost, steeled themselves for a fight. and so did the French. By this time, England, together with Scotland and Wales, had officially become known as Great Britain, also known as the United Kingdom or UK. What do you suppose that response means? None. Does it sound like the French are going to cooperate? Nope. Yet another war broke out in 1754. This war is known as the French and Indian War. Fought in the forests of North America, this war went on for a very long time, almost 9 years in all. Colonists in North America were asked to fight for this land. Britain also sent thousands of soldiers across the Atlantic Ocean to fight. Many Native Americans in the region, such as the Huron, fought with the French in this war. Others, such as the Iroquois, sided with the British. 2 years later, the war over the colonial territory in North America spread to other parts of the world where France and Great Britain competed for land, such as Europe, the West Indies, and India. This phase of the war is known as the 7 Years' War in Great Britain. Why were Native Americans called Indians by the colonists? Do you remember? Well, when Columbus encountered Native Americans in the Bahamas, or Native peoples in the Bahamas, he thought he had landed in the East Indies off the coast of India. So they shouldn't be called Indians because they're not from India. Eventually, after much conflict, the British captured the French-controlled city of Quebec, Canada. The capture of Quebec in 1759 was a turning point for the British, who eventually won the war. In 1763, the war was over, but this was the beginning of the end for French fortune in North America. Although the French and the British signed a peace treaty, the Native Americans did not. Fighting a war for many years is a very expensive thing to do. When it was over, the British Parliament realized that they had spent a great deal of money. Britain was in financial trouble, and someone had to help get them out of it. That someone was the 13 colonies. The Prime Minister of Great Britain at the end of the French and Indian War was a man named George Grenville. George Grenville was asked to come up with a plan to pay off Britain's debt. He thought long and hard about this and did indeed come up with a plan. How about taxing the colonists? He thought to himself. After all, Great Britain fought the war to defend the colonists against the French and the Native Americans. Grenville presented his plan to King George III in Parliament. Everyone in Britain agreed. It was a great plan, or at least it was for now. If the Prime Minister wanted to tax the colonists, what does that mean? It means he's going to make them pay a fee to Great Britain. They have to pay money. Does this sound fair to you? Why or not? In 1764, the British Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This law placed a tax on foreign sugar and molasses. By making foreign sugar and molasses more expensive, the colonists were being forced to buy these goods from the British producers in the West Indies. However, this act did not just include sugar, it also included wine, cloth, coffee, and silk. The colonists were now taxed if they chose to buy less expensive products from other nations. Then in 1765, the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act stated that all printed materials produced in the colonies would be taxed. Newspapers, magazines, legal documents, and believe it or not, even cards would cost more. People were required to buy a stamp and place it on the paper item they had purchased. This is not to be confused with the postage stamp, which is purchased and attached to a letter to mail it, which should cost money because people have to work at it, right? In the same year, the Quartering Act was passed by the British Parliament. This meant that colonists had to help provide quarters or temporary places to live for the British soldiers stationed in the colonies. The colonists also had to provide supplies such as food, bedding, candles, and firewood. So So that meant that some guy in a British uniform could come knock on your house door and be like, hey, I need a place to stay and some food. And because of this law, you had to say, okay, here's a bedroom, and I made you some ham and some pie, and here's some candles and some firewood. You had to give those to people, even if you didn't know them or didn't want to help them. You just had to because of the Quartering Act. Quarters are like a place where people stay, where they live. So the Quartering Act told you that you had to let British soldiers stay with you. For many years, the colonists had handled their own affairs. Now, members of a government 3,000 miles away had voted to tax the colonists. The colonists were not allowed to vote for these British leaders, so they felt their views and thoughts were not represented in the British government. Many colonists believed that it was unfair that they had to pay taxes, but did not have representation in the British Parliament. There was nobody there to say what they wanted, right? Because they couldn't vote for anybody. The British responded that members of Parliament considered the interests of the entire empire and not simply the areas they represented. Although most people had accepted the Sugar Act and Quartering Act, they were not prepared to accept the Stamp Act without a fight. Some outspoken colonists began to suggest that they should not pay it. They cried, "No taxation without representation." Or someone to speak for them. These colonists didn't beat around the bush. They said what they meant. You'll hear more in the next read aloud about these outspoken colonists and the events that continued to lead to the American Revolution. Why were conflicts increasing among the Spanish, French, and English? They each had settlements in the Americas and were land hungry. They clashed over the areas of North America they wanted for themselves. It's mine. No, it's mine. It's my land. However, these areas were not uninhabited, right? It wasn't their land at all. Who was there first? How were the Native Americans involved? They were distressed. Many of them had moved westward to escape the influx of colonists, and now the English were beginning to enter that area as well. What war broke out in 1675 between the Native Americans and the English in New England? King Philip's War, led by Chief Metacom of the Wampanoag, son of Chief Massasoit. What was the result? The English won and destroyed even more of the Wampanoag homes. Sad. Describe what you see in this image. What was the name of this war between the French and English, which involved Native Americans fighting on both sides? French and Indian War. Where was this war fought? In the forests of North America. Where was another war occurring between France and England? In other parts of the world where the French and the British competed for land, such as Europe, the West Indies, and India. How did the French and Indian War end? How did it end? The British captured Quebec, the French capital, and won the war. The French and English signed a peace treaty. Did the Native Americans sign a peace treaty? No. How did all these battles affect colonial life? Do you think this was a just or unjust decision? Why? To recover from the cost of these battles, the Parliament of Britain decided that taxing the colonists was a good way to help pay for the war. Do you think this was a just or unjust decision, and why? Do you think the British should have taxed the colonists? What were the three acts passed by Parliament that taxed the colonists? Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Quartering Act. How did the outspoken colonists react to all of these taxes? What was the saying used to describe how they felt? They felt distress, and it was unjust. They said, "No taxation without representation." They steeled themselves for a fight against Britain. Why do you think the colonists began to feel less and less like Europeans? The colonists did not feel recognized by Britain, and some felt that no one cared about their interests. They weren't represented by leadership, and they were so far away from all the decisions that were happening in Britain. Our word for the day is uninhabited. In the read aloud you heard, this land was not uninhabited either. Native Americans had been living in this region for a long time, some of them having been forced to move west away from the eastern regions in order to escape the influx of settlers. Say the word uninhabited. Uninhabited refers to a place where there are no people living there. The ruins of the uninhabited town were so eerily quiet that you could hear a pin drop. Have you ever visited or seen a place that was uninhabited? Where was it? What was it like? So if we look at the word uninhabited, we know that the prefix un means not, right? So what do you think inhabited means? If uninhabited means nobody lives there. Inhabited means that people do live there. What do you see in the word inhabit? Habit looks like habitat, which is where animals live. All right, third graders, we are getting into the American Revolution, or the beginning of it, which I find exciting. Freedom from Britain, finally.